Hello, everyone. Great to have you back for another episode of Palestine This Week with me, Nassim Ahmed, and my regular guest, Mouin Rabbani. Mouin, welcome and thank you for joining us again.
Well, and thank you as always for having me, Nassim. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, we missed you last week. You're traveling, and great to have you back.
Yes, I was discussing genocide in Berlin, and I live to tell the tale.
Yes, thankfully. I mean, I do want to ask you about Trump's, the UN resolution endorsing Trump's 20-point peace plan. We discussed that last week, but I want to get your thoughts on that as well. But we will begin with Gaza's number of reports that I want to discuss with you. Then move over to the West Bank, where the UN, not UN, the
Human Rights
Human
Watch.
Rights
Yeah.
Watch published this new amazing report about the ethnic cleansing that's taking place in the occupied West Bank. Over 32,000 Palestinians have been ethnically cleansed over the past few months. So I want to discuss that with you as well. And Netanyahu um, seeking to, prevent Arab Palestinians from taking part in Israeli elections. So he's looking to review new rules, election rules in Israel. So we want to discuss that as well. Another interesting subject, which I don't know if you've seen it, but I want to discuss with you anyway. One of the French members of the ICC judge, one of the judge for the ICC, just the incredible difficulties he's facing as a result of US sanctions. It's incredible what he's having to go through, and the level of authoritarianism and the extent to which the US is able to um, have a grip on people's lives outside, America, in France and elsewhere, who they deem
Yes.
to be not abiding by American interests. It's quite scary to see that. So I want to discuss that as well. But let's begin, as I said, with the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation on Monday declared that that was the end of its mission in Gaza, 9 months after its establishment. But then there was reports by drop site news that UG Solutions, which founded the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. UG Solutions is a leading US military contractor. So they provide the muscle and the security for various projects. So there was a report that they are actually re-interviewing mercenaries to renew or take up another mission in the Gaza Strip. So I want to get to Trump's plan later on. One of the elements of Trump's plan is the International Stabilization Force. We don't really know who will take part in that International Stabilization Force. It seems like, to me anyway, that UG Solutions may end up being the agency who gets a contract to enforce security in the Gaza Strip once again, because I don't see any Arab countries under the current framework um, providing the security required for Trump's peace plan.
Well, it's a little unclear what's going on. As you mentioned, the GHF death squads immediately evacuated as soon as the Israeli military left certain areas of the Gaza Strip, for the simple reason that they would have been ripped to shreds, and rightfully so, if I may add, given all the death and destruction, the serial murder that they committed during their tenure in the Gaza Strip, which we've spoken about previously. And as as the conclusion of that sordid exercise, GHF announced that it was formally disbanding very recently. But at the same time, as you just mentioned, UG Solutions is now recruiting a new batch of mercenaries. And then the question becomes what for? And I think this has less to do with the United Nations Security Council resolution, which we're going to discuss, but more to do with the emerging reality in the Gaza Strip, which is that the Gaza Strip has effectively been partitioned with about half of it, just over half, under the control of the Israeli military, and the other half under Palestinian control. And the Americans floating this idea that they will limit reconstruction to that half of the Gaza Strip, which is under Israeli control. Now, I think reconstruction is a very exaggerated term to use in this respect. It's basically providing the most rudimentary forms of shelter and humanitarian supplies and so on. And it may well be the case that UG Solutions is being recruited to provide security to the occupiers in that half of the Gaza Strip. Now, this, of course, all depends on two issues. The first is the willingness of large numbers of Palestinians to move from the Palestinian controlled zone of the Gaza Strip to the Israeli occupied zone. And the second is that it depends on the sustainability of this partition. And I think both of these remain unanswered questions. I think Israel and the United States will do everything they can to create a genuine humanitarian crisis and emergency in the Palestinian controlled zone in order to seek to compel Palestinians to relocate to the Israeli controlled zone. But given the history, which is that there is neither safety nor security in any part of the Gaza Strip, it's an open question to what extent Palestinians will be willing to relocate. Secondly, if this begins to take on the appearance of an indefinite partition of the Gaza Strip, in which Israel, with U.S. support, plans to remain in direct occupation of half the Gaza Strip, that is going to complicate the American intentions to recruit Gulf funding and Arab and Muslim armed forces to serve as a stabilization force in the Gaza Strip. So I would say this is Israel and the United States preparing for their preferred scenario, but it remains unclear to what extent they will actually be able to implement it in practice in the manner that they would like to.
So yeah, there's a lot of ambiguity. There's a lot
Yes.
of unanswered questions with regards to Trump's peace plan. Despite that, the UN Security Council endorsed the plan. Um, and there was an interview last week with a number of Hamas leaders. One of them, yeah, on Dropsite News,
Yes,
and
Osama Hamdan. Yeah.
Usama Hamdan, that's it.
And
Usama
Mohammed
Hamdan and
al-Hindi from
Muhammad al-Hindi,
Islamic
that's it.
Jihad.
Muhammad
Yes.
Hamdan, Usama. And it's a very long interview. Now, I would suggest readers to go and have a look at that article, just about their views on the UN resolution, Trump's peace plan. And there's a lot of chatter, demand by Israel and the Americans of Hamas's disarmament. Hamas is basically saying, they haven't really defeated us in war. And disarmament is really being used as a pretext because, really, on the one hand, Israel claims they've destroyed Hamas. 95% of Hamas has been destroyed. The weapons have been destroyed as well. So there really is nothing for them to disarm, and Palestinian resistance only exists because of Israeli occupation. So the demand for disarmament isn't a reasonable demand, given that Hamas has not been defeated in battle. So that's their position, and they say this is only being used as a pretext to prolong the war, because completely ending the war would pose a massive problem for Netanyahu. Netanyahu wants to continue the genocide. This is what Hamas is saying, and if anything, their position is that Trump's peace plan offered an off-ramp for Israel to preserve its face and continue its genocidal agenda. So that's the argument they present in this article.
Yes.
And I thought which was a very revealing piece, and want to get your thoughts, of course, on the UN Security Council resolution, and also the argument that The disarmament of Hamas is being used as a pretext to continue the genocide. And also, this resolution offers Israel an off ramp because they failed to defeat Hamas on the battlefield, and they're now using the UN Security Council and Arab states to legitimize a colonial structure.
Yes, so this very lengthy article and drop site that you mentioned is based on interviews with Osama Hamdan, a Hamas leader, and Mohammed al-Hindi, the chief negotiator of Islamic Jihad, and it interviews a number of other uh, Palestinian representatives, Musa Abu Marzouk from Hamas, the independent Mustafa al-Barghouti, and it tries to sketch how the Palestinians responded to the efforts to craft this 20-point plan and then to the demands that were made upon Hamas as a result of that plan, or on the Palestinians more generally, as a result of that plan, and as a result of the subsequent United Nations Security Council resolution. And the key parts of that article relate to disarmament, and specifically that the U.S. negotiator or mediator, however you want to characterize him, I prefer to call him the de facto Secretary of State, Steve Witkoff, in a interview or a speech somewhere, claimed that when he and Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, met directly with Hamas, that Hamas had given them a commitment that it would disarm pursuant to the terms of the Trump initiative and the subsequent Security Council resolution. And every Palestinian who's interviewed in this article rejects that and makes the point that there were a large number of Palestinians in that meeting and that they all share this view. So the question becomes, what is the actual position of the Palestinians? And it is twofold. The first is that this agreement must result in a comprehensive cessation of hostilities, and the second, in an Israeli withdrawal. And regarding the issue of disarmament, that is tied to political objectives. In other words, as Hamas has repeatedly stated, it will only surrender its weapons to to the security forces of a sovereign and independent Palestinian state. And it will neither surrender them to Israel, nor to the United States, nor to any international stabilization force that would enter the Gaza Strip to try to succeed. Whereas, you note, Israel, over the course of 2 long and very, very bloody years, failed to achieve this objective. You know, there's a basic principle of negotiations, which is that you cannot extract on the negotiating table what you fail to achieve on the battlefield. And here we have Israel seeking to dictate objectives to the Palestinians that it systematically failed to achieve, and at the same time seeking to make others responsible for achieving that. Now, you know, if Trump or Netanyahu genuinely believe that Egyptian or Palestinian or Azerbaijani forces are going to enter the Gaza Strip in order to disarm the Palestinians on Israel's behalf, they're obviously going to be in for a big surprise. The other point that some of these Palestinians make in this article is that Netanyahu is already claiming to have wiped out Hamas and removed 95% of its weapons. So, you know, if there's even a semblance of truth to his bragging and boasting, why is he making such a big issue out of something he's effectively claiming he has already achieved? Excuse me. Now, turning to the Security Council resolution, it effectively gives the Trump plan the force of international law. It's the consensus of the international community. 13 voted against, 2 abstained. 13 voted in favor, and to abstain. Now, why did Russia and China abstain instead of vetoing? I think the reasons are quite clear. Russia needs the United States to achieve its objectives in Ukraine and was not going to jeopardize its relations with Washington for the sake of bloodletting in the Gaza Strip. And the Chinese, I think, had very similar calculations, which is that they are engaged in these very intensive trade and tariff negotiations with the United States and weren't going to let the Palestinians get in the way of those either. I thought the most interesting explanation of the vote was by the Algerian representative, who I thought made quite clear that he was not at all in favor of this resolution, but as the representative of the Arab group, he was essentially left with no choice because the Palestinian Authority leader in Ramallah, Mahmoud Abbas, as well as the Arab group, had all accepted this resolution. And as the effective Arab representative on the Security Council, he had little choice but to vote for it. Now, what's going to happen next? Well, as we've discussed previously, these 20 points are really just broad, vague statements of principle that leave massive amounts of detail to be negotiated, to be agreed, to be implemented. So it would effectively compel the Palestinians to enter into something very akin to an Oslo process, where the temporary becomes the indefinite, becomes the permanent, but this time with a much lower ceiling. And we often find that where there is vagueness, where there is a lack of specificity, Israel usually gains the upper hand in being able to dictate the contours and the outlines of such an agreement. And we're already seeing that with the ceasefire, where Israel's escalating attacks on Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, akin to what it's been doing in Lebanon, is essentially transforming what is supposed to be a bilateral ceasefire into a shell in which the Palestinians are required to maintain an absolute commitment to a cessation of hostilities, but Israel is increasingly not bound by any restraints or restrictions and is able to do so because it has US support and European acquiescence. So that's kind of the broad outlines. Then I think the most dangerous parts of this resolution is that it effectively places the Gaza Strip under foreign control. It creates a kind of mandate over the international mandate over the Gaza Strip to be administered by none other than Donald Trump and Tony Blair. And second of all, it authorizes the establishment of this international stabilization force, but not under any kind of UN supervision or United Nations terms of reference or UN leadership or anything of the sort. So you can almost think of it as kind of a private army to be commanded by Trump and Blair to do their bidding. The problem with this entire exercise is that under Arab pressure, it makes an extraordinarily vague and tentative reference to Palestinian self-determination and statehood. You know, if the Palestinian Authority meets the following 17 million conditions within the next 10,000 years, then maybe we will be in a position to perhaps begin discussing if perhaps there could be progress on recognizing Palestinian aspirations. And almost immediately after the resolution was adopted, Israeli leaders from Prime Minister Netanyahu on down came up and very publicly stated that there, as far as they're concerned, there will never be a Palestinian state. Under these conditions, it's going to be exceptionally difficult, and in most cases, I would argue, impossible for Trump and his sidekick Blair to either um, uh, to either acquire the necessary funds for whatever they plan from Gaza from the Gulf states, or to mobilize the troops that they will need for this international stabilization force. Is it dead in the water? Not exactly, but it's in more than one respect, I think, essentially stillborn. And I'd be very surprised if it is implemented in anywhere near the manner that is envisioned by the proposal's authors. And just one last point is it was also meant to turbocharge, if you will, the transition from the initiative's first phase to the second phase, where you begin to talk about administration, governance, disarmament, and so on. And while this may be something that the United States would very much like to see, I think Israel would be quite satisfied to see these negotiations lead nowhere, because it will then be able to use this as a pretext to block reconstruction, to block the entry of aid, to once again transform the question of Palestine from a political question at the very center of the international agenda into a humanitarian question about giving, rice and flour and sugar to desperate refugees.
Yeah, I think I'm with you on the idea that this plan is not really going to get off the ground. Last week, Mohammed bin Salman visited Trump in the White House, and every time he was asked about normalization, he said, yes, normalization on the condition that there is a Palestinian state. So they don't seem to be backing down on that condition that,
Yes.
there is no way we can normalize. So if there is no Palestinian state, there is no way that Gulf countries
Yes. And
would
and
put a
and if
single
I
dollar
may,
into this.
yeah, and if I could just, sorry for interrupting, just to add one more thing. I think it was something like 48 hours later, there was the annual resolution on the question of Palestine in the General Assembly, which
So,
basically reconfirmed all the fundamental and inalienable Palestinian rights, self-determination, sovereignty, statehood, and so on. And it passed with an overwhelming majority. Of course, the U.S., Israel, a smattering of Pacific Islands and allied autocracies voted against. But then again, the U.S. and Israel were also alone in voting against a General Assembly resolution prohibiting torture. So we are,
yeah, I was just about to say that the same two countries, the whole world opposed to a resolution condemning, I mean, supporting a resolution condemning torture,
yes,
saying it's illegal and crime against humanity. Israel and the US stood alone as the only two countries, maybe another country as well, like Argentina as well,
yes,
opposing
yeah,
a resolution prescribing torture, which is unfathomable. But you can see why Israel, for the last 2 years, we've seen documents after documents, evidence after
yes,
evidence, proving that they've been torturing Palestinian detainees, not just in the Gaza Strip, but also in the West Bank, which is what I want to turn to now. So um, there was a Human Rights Watch report last week, um, just showing the extent to which Israel has been carrying out this policy of ethnic cleansing in three Palestinian refugee areas in Jenin, Tul Karum, and Nur Shams. In total, something like 32,000 Palestinians have been expelled from those villages. They've not been allowed to return, and also they've called on the international community to take actions, legal actions against a number of Israeli commanders who they accuse of war crimes and crimes against humanity. It's quite a lengthy report, but it's kind of gone ignored by the mainstream media,
very much so.
as probably you'd expect. But it shows one of the things we discussed last week, how in the West Bank, the settlers have become empowered, they've become emboldened as well. And there is no restraint on them from the state of Israel, because the settlers really are an arm of the Israeli state right from the beginning of the creation of the state
Yes,
of Israel. And because of this sense of impunity they have, they are carrying out pogroms, and now it's been documented by Human Rights Watch. and there doesn't seem to be any way of restraining the settlers or bringing them under control. Even though I think a year and a half ago, the ICJ, International Court of Justice, issued a declaration stating that Israel's occupation of the West Bank is illegal and everything must be done to end its illegal occupation of the West Bank.
Yes, I'm just looking up All My Dreams Have Been Erased, Israel's Forced Displacement of Palestinians in the West Bank is the title of this report. And as one would expect from Human Rights Watch, it's a very thorough and very detailed report based on very impressive amounts of field work. And what has distinguished Human Rights Watch reporting, certainly in the last several years, is at this time, once again, Human Rights Watch is drawing the appropriate conclusions from its own findings rather than trying to minimize them. And in this particular case, it's looking at the forced displacement of tens of thousands of Palestinians, approximately 32,000, as you mentioned, from the three northernmost refugee camps in the West Bank, Jenin, Tulkarem, and Nur Shams, which, if I'm not mistaken, is also in Tulkarem. And it shows how soldiers are literally going door to door, forcibly expelling Palestinians, not only from their homes, but from the refugee camps as a whole, and then also forcibly preventing them from returning. Now, we can talk about settler violence as much as you like, and all of it could be correct, but this report alone demonstrates that the most violent and lawless and illegal actor in the Gaza Strip is, in fact, none other than the Israeli state acting through the formal Israeli military. And the Human Rights Watch report quotes, for example, Israeli Defense Minister Yisrael Katz saying that these people will be prevented from returning, and that is placed in the context of Israel's enhanced, amplified effort to seek to, from its point of view, liquidate the refugee question by liquidating refugee camps. But then there's a other aspect that I found quite interesting, where some Israeli officials are saying that they are actually seizing control of these refugee camps for a prolonged period in order to create wider streets, a kind of a grid in these refugee camps, so that in future Israeli tanks and armored personnel carriers and so on will have easier access to what has been narrow warrens and alleys. And this would be very reminiscent to what the Israeli military did in the Gaza Strip in the early 1970s, when it was faced with an armed insurgency against its occupation there. So where this is going to end up is unclear. I think it also, of course, depends on how Israel's sponsors and allies in the West respond to this. And thus far, there has been very little response. But on the whole, I think, Israel feels sufficiently empowered now that it can unilaterally deal with these issues as it pleases, with impunity, without accountability. And I think that explains these horrible mass forced displacements in the northern West Bank. And I think it's entirely to be expected that we will see similar initiatives elsewhere in the West Bank, if there is no strong international response to what has already been happening in the northern West Bank.
Yeah, I mean, these operations in the long term, Israel, to me, it seems like it's putting itself in a much more narrower position. It's clearly blocking all possible ways out of its occupation. That's what it should be seeking to do. And there was in the original drop site news we were discussing with the Hamas leaders, um, again on the question about disarming. They said Hamas will be obsolete. If there was no occupation, there would be no resistance. There would be no
Exactly.
need for Hamas to exist. But Israel continues to create these areas of hopelessness for the Palestinians. Where are these 32,000 meant to go? Israel has not provided any shelter. They've destroyed their homes, which they've been there for generations now. There's just another generation of hopelessness that's been created. So these these operations create levels of hopelessness, which leads Palestinians to only one option, which is
Leave or fight
armed
or flight.
resistance. So,
Yeah.
in the interview, Hamas was kind of alluding to that. Okay, Israel wants us to disarm. We can disarm. That's fine. But if there's an occupation, if there's hopelessness, then of course, if it's not Hamas, it's going to be someone else, another generation of youth who will
Yes.
resist Israel's brutal, illegal occupation. So to make us obsolete, to make armed resistance obsolete, end the occupation. And I thought, that's a simple formula, it seems to me anyway.
Very much so. Yep, it really is that simple,
Yeah.
but we're always told it's such a complex question. You can't even begin to understand it unless you spend decades studying it in detail. But it's as simple as any other colonial situation across recent centuries.
Mm.
And the
Let,
solution is just as straightforward.
yeah. Let's move to Netanyahu. I think I'll discuss maybe one or two things with Netanyahu. First is he's looking to introduce changes to the electoral system, which will make it very, very difficult for Arab parties to compete in any upcoming elections. So again, for those who think Israel is not an apartheid state, and they point to, oh, look, there's Arab parties who take part in Israeli elections. Israel has consistently tried to block Arab parties from taking part. They put one hurdle after another, and Netanyahu is seeking to do something similar again. The last time they did something like that was in 2014, after which Arab parties came together under what was known as the Joint List to overcome these hurdles. But for his own personal political gain and to make sure that the far right coalition or far right parties have a better chance of winning more seats in the Knesset, he's seeking to introduce new electoral changes. What do you know about these changes that he's trying
Yeah.
to introduce?
Well, this concerns two separate things. The first is an initiative to lower the threshold of minimal votes required by a political party contesting the elections to be able to, what do you call it, elect members to the new parliament. And this is something that is expected to benefit primarily the smaller far right parties, and that would serve Netanyahu in two ways. On the one hand, there will be more parties represented in the Israeli parliament that would be willing to enter into a coalition with him. And at the same time, I think from his point of view, the more diverse or larger the coalition is, the easier it would be for him to control its individual parts. The second is something we've seen repeatedly in recent decades, is that the credentials of Arab political parties are challenged. I'm a little unsure of what the formal basis is, but if I'm not mistaken, Israeli political parties contesting parliamentary elections are required to recognize Israel as a Jewish and democratic state or something along those lines. And those who don't do so can be prevented from participating in Israeli elections. And there are various other
Well,
requirements.
in this instance, he's also piggybacking on Trump's prescription of the Muslim Brotherhood. So
Yes,
who will also prescribe.
yes,
He said, thanks to President Trump, who's recognized the need to prescribe the
yes,
Muslim Brotherhood, we will also now do that. Even though I think a Muslim a party with origins in the Muslim Brotherhood, but not any kind of armed support. They were in the previous Israeli
yes.
coalition. So yeah, so he said he'll prescribe all the parties that have a
Yes, and
history
this
of
is a
belonging to
party
them.
that Netanyahu desperately tried to persuade to enter his own coalition and
Yeah.
almost succeeded in doing so, but now it's apparently beyond the pale. But I think it's also an effort to characterize certain parties as supporting terrorism and so on. But as several Israeli political analysts have noted, that Netanyahu, being the consummate demagogue, is expected, particularly in the context of the Gaza genocide and the increasing extremism of Israeli society, to fight the upcoming elections essentially by campaigning against Israel's Palestinian citizens and their political parties, by trying to make this a referendum on the legitimacy of Palestinian political, Arab political representation in the Israeli parliament. And he appears to be off to a very fast start. And what people are saying is that, these measures are routinely taken almost with every Israeli election. And usually at the first stage of the process, such candidates or parties are barred from participating, but are then overruled by, I can't remember exactly what it's called, the Supreme Electoral Commission or something along that lines. But it is expected to be likely that on this occasion, with the increasing right-wing representative, I think it's called the Central Elections Committee, that these efforts to ban candidates and parties from participating in the elections may well succeed.
Let's leave West Bank now. I want to discuss a story which hasn't really been covered, but I think it should be, just highlighting the extent to which American crackdown on pro-Palestinian activism has taken another dimension. In this case, just the challenges, the difficulties faced by ICC judges of all people who the US prescribed on Israel's behalf, I should say. So there was a report in a French newspaper of a French member of the ICC International Criminal Court by the name of Nicolas
EU.
Guillo, and I think his predicament is really quite astonishing. So after the Americans prescribed put sanctions on the ICC, he's found himself in a situation where he's not able to make hotel reservations through Expedia, through Google. He's not able to open accounts in Amazon. His Visa cards have been declined, MasterCard, American Express card, and it's quite dystopian if you think about it.
Yeah.
So he described himself as being economically banned across most of the planet. And this is a French judge in the ICC. So if the Americans can do that to a French judge in the ICC, what kind of authoritarianism is the world facing now? This kind of a nightmarish scenario where the reach is so far that you don't have to belong to the US or to a country with an authoritarian government to feel the oppression of that government. You could
Yeah.
be in a democracy like in the UK or in France
Yeah.
or in Germany and still be a victim of this draconian authoritarian policy.
Yeah, I mean, there are essentially three aspects of this story. The first shows that, in the 21st century, in the 2020s, how absolutely dependent we are on digital access for communication, for banking, for all kinds of things. The second is it shows the extreme and vicious vengefulness of the United States in going after anyone who dares challenge the impunity of its favorite state. Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur on the territories occupied by Israel in 1967, is experiencing identical challenges, and now you have this judge at the International Criminal Court, the French judge Nicolas Guillou, who is basically unable to function as the way that you or I would be able to. And there's so many common daily tasks that he can no longer do, either because it relies on American companies, or in many cases, on European companies that rely on, at least in part, on American technology. And in each and every single case, he is effectively banned and made a non-person. But the third aspect, which I think is the most interesting, is that this judge is a French citizen serving in an international court of which France is a founding member and supposedly a defender. And neither the French government nor the Dutch government, where the International Criminal Court is based, nor the European Union are lifting a finger in support of this judge who was effectively conducting the work on their behalf that they have authorized and requested him to do. And that to me is the most disturbing aspect of this entire story. We know the Americans are deranged maniacs when it comes to anyone who challenges Israeli impunity. Um, but what about his own government? What about the European Union that blabs on and on about the rules-based international order and the sanctity of international law and all the rest of it, 24 hours a day in a high-pitched voice? They have literally done nothing to protect and defend what can only be described as one of their own. And do you really also think that people of Judge Guillau's stature and experience and so on will be willing to take up positions like his in years to come when they see not only the measures that can be instituted against them, but the absolute unwillingness of their own governments to defend them. Now, the idea, of course, is that, send a clear message. As long as you lay off Israel, you'll be safe and you don't have to worry. So keep going after the Africans. You can throw out indictment against a Russian or Chinese or North Korean, for racial balance, but that's really where it ends.
Mm.
Israel is a prohibited zone.
Yeah, when I read about this, it reminded me of the Chinese credit system. This very system which sanctions censors bad behavior, let's just say, but they do it to their own citizens. The system does not sanctions a French
It's
citizen,
extraterritoriality.
and
Yeah.
here you have the Americans who have the ability to sanction people who uh, misbehave when it comes to Israel. And it's just quite shocking that one day you and I may find ourselves in a scenario where the Americans can simply cancel our bank accounts, our credit cards, and prevent us from booking holidays on this platform and that platform. And this is Chinese credit system on steroids, I would say. This is even much worse scenario we find ourselves in.
Yes, and again, the most disturbing part of this entire story to me is that um, there are no repercussions for French or European companies that comply with U.S. extraterritorial sanctions against French citizens who not only have not violated any French or European law, but are in fact fulfilling what are supposed to be its proclaimed ideals. So all these French companies, all these European companies are are perfectly free to cut this judge off from his banks, from his email, from everything else, and no one is saying a word that there's anything untoward happening.
Yeah, so which neatly takes us on to our next story. So even though you have the mightiest superpower in the world going all Gestapo on behalf of Israel, if you're someone like Melanie Phillips or Sarah Horowitz, you are still the biggest victim. You have countries after countries lining up to crack down and suppress, become authoritarian, to defend Israel and protect Zionist entities. Melanie Phillips this week went out and said that, as Jews, we face an existential crisis. The whole world is against us. We need to, instead of mowing the lawn in Gaza, we need to completely annihilate everyone. And then you have someone else by the name of Sarah Horowitz, whose video on social media has just gone completely viral, videos after videos, where she seems to be the biggest victim in all this, and suggesting that the biggest lessons of the genocide and the Holocaust has not been misunderstood or not learned properly. So we need to re-educate generations of Jews who are now sympathizing with Palestinians because they've now taken the wrong lessons from the Holocaust. Sympathizing with genocide in Gaza, how that's the wrong lesson in her mind, that is the wrong lesson or from the past 2 years, which is quite an extraordinary claim and quite an extraordinary pushback by these figures and many others like them against what is now a global international movement, again, and a realization, I would say, about what Zionism really entails, what it really means in reality.
Yeah, yeah. Hurwitz's interview, for lack of a better word, was thoroughly repulsive. Basically, as you mentioned, saying if people think Palestinians shouldn't be slaughtered, if people are against the genocide, the Gaza genocide, they've taken the wrong lessons from the Holocaust, and then going so far as to say, the real crime is not these tens of thousands of dead Palestinian children in the Gaza Strip, but the fact that it's unsuccessfully suppressed and that people are seeing these images and that these images are having an impact on people's perceptions and politics, and that somehow this all needs to be fixed. And bear in mind, Hurwitz is a former speechwriter for Barack Obama, the former U.S. president, and of course, he hasn't said a word about this. So I think we should assume that he's completely on board with this message, because we've now reached the stage where when people think that they can remain silent without being complicit, that's a thing of the past. Unless Obama says otherwise, I think we need to insist, and we're perfectly entitled to presume that she speaks for him as well. That he has out, or that at the very least, that he has absolutely no problem with how one of his, how this person who he relied on for so long to put his own views into writing is representing things. As far as Melanie Phillips is concerned, I mean, talk about a deranged psycho. This woman was speaking at a conference. I think it was called Rage Against Hate. I mean,
Mm.
irony of ironies, and the bloodlust coming out of her was so thick you could cut it with a knife. I mean, you listen to her, her raging Islamophobia, on the one hand, she's saying Palestinians don't exist, but at the same time, in so many words, they all need to be slaughtered. Um, you get the impression listening to her that there really is no quantity of Palestinian blood, of dead Muslims that could ever satisfy her. You get the impression that even if every last one is slaughtered, she would still be baying for more and more and more. Really, completely, for normal people like you, and I would like to think myself as well, it's so far off the deep end. Um, it's a scandal that we even have to discuss it. But go back and listen not only to her words, but to where she gets rousing applause from the psychos in her audience.
Mm. When I watched both videos, I was wondering, I mean, do they actually realize that, that this will
They
go
think they're
viral?
speaking truth to power.
Yeah, yeah, that's what they're thinking, but I think they don't realize how, well, maybe they're not self-aware, that how this will be received by the global audience. because you're not speaking to a Zionist community or Zionist organization. Your comments are being aired across the world, which is why Horowitz's video got something like millions and millions of views, and she was the main story for 3 or 4 days on social media, and the universal consensus on her was that this person is completely unhinged, completely deranged, and her rhetoric, her reasoning is pretty much genocidal reasoning, which I think I took a lot of hope from that. The fact that there was
Yeah.
universal condemnation of that. So I'm not. Are
But
these
not a
people?
peep from her former boss, who,
Mm,
again, unless I hear otherwise, he's perfectly fine with this.
yeah, and and again to show how a lot of these guys can be so detached from reality. We have another story with the U.S. envoy.
If I may just interrupt, Nassim, I'm sorry, but imagine if she had come up and started speaking in support of the Hamas attacks of October 7th and talking about how important it was for Palestinians to continue the armed struggle and whatnot. Do you really think we wouldn't have heard a peep out of Barack Obama? Absolutely not. He
Yeah.
would have he would have been up denouncing her and disassociating himself from her while she was still speaking.
Mm. Yeah, and talking about, as I said, detached from reality, you have another story about the U.S. envoy Mike Huckabee,
Yeah.
who met with Jonathan Pollard. So
Yes.
this guy who is a convicted spy, um, um, the U.S. ambassador met with him, and it's got a lot of backlash, and many have called for his resignation, and he should resign. I mean, you had something similar in the UK where former foreign minister Priti Patel, she went on Israel, she went to Israel and conducted meetings with Israeli officials, but without the backing of
Or the
the
knowledge.
government or the knowledge of the government. It's as though she was conducting a parallel, foreign policy to the UK, her personal parallel foreign policy to Britain. And it seems like Huckabee was doing something similar. I mean, here you have a convicted spy. How an American envoy could actually meet with him, it beggars belief. But there you are, he, completely detached from how this will be received by Americans back home, and overwhelmingly, the America First constituency have called for his resignation,
Yes.
but it doesn't seem to be any movement towards that, and then a lot of silence over that.
Well, th this is very interesting, I think, in several respects. The first, which you just alluded to, is it shows the growing divisions on the U.S. right with respect to Israel. And in contrast to many critics of Israel on the left, the criticism of Israel on the right seems to focus very much on the perception, the belief that U.S. leaders are putting Israeli interests ahead of U.S. interests. So it's a much more, if you will, how should I put it? It's much more interest based than necessarily criticism of what Israel is doing to the Palestinians or so on. And here you have Jonathan J. Pollard, who was caught trying to escape the FBI by running into the Israeli embassy in 1985, was put on trial and sentenced, I think, to 30 years or
30
life
years.
in prison. Yes. And is described by the US, including by former US Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger, as the most damaging spy in American history from a purportedly friendly nation. And the damage he did to U.S. national security was apparently immense in terms of all the documents and so on that he transferred to the Israelis over the years. He was an American citizen, which is important to know. And I think it was during the George W. Bush administration that there was an effort to release him from prison, and the FBI director or sorry, rather, it was during the Clinton
Clinton,
administration,
sorry.
in which Netanyahu demanded Pollard's release in exchange for some, minor gesture towards the Palestinians during the 1990s. Um, and the then director of the FBI, George Tenet, stated that if Pollard was released, he would hand in his resignation the next day. It was left to Obama, who we just spoke about, to graciously release Pollard from prison. And this was, and ironically, this was seen as part of the U.S. compensation to Israel for the U.S. signing the Iran nuclear agreement, which was actually, as many Israeli security leaders have said, was an excellent deal for Israel, and which Netanyahu then did everything in his power to undermine. Now, one of the main campaigners for Pollard's release over the years was none other than Mike Huckabee, who is now the U.S. ambassador to Israel. And after Pollard was released, given that it was believed he could still do significant security damage to the U.S., he was prevented from leaving the United States and had all kinds of restrictions on use of electronic devices and so on. During the first Trump administration, he was pardoned and permitted to leave to Israel, where he immediately joined the extreme right. And it's in this context that many on the U.S. right find Huckabee not only meeting with Pollard, but meeting with him in secret quite perplexing, particularly because when Pollard was contacted after this meeting, he basically started criticizing Trump, tried to present Trump as some kind of pro-Hamas figure or Qatari agent or what. The guy is really on the extreme of the extreme right. But, for people like Huckabee, he's a hero. For people like Huckabee, he's a model. He is everything that an American should be. And it is in this context, I think, that you're seeing these demands for Huckabee's resignation, because Huckabee's problem is not that he can't distinguish between U.S. and Israeli interests. He distinguishes between them very well and has consistently taken the position that Israeli interests should and must always take precedence over U.S. interests.
Mm. Yeah, let's end on Lebanon. We've spoken quite a lot, and I think there's a key major development in Lebanon from over the weekend. There was an assassination by Israel of a Hezbollah leader by the name of Haytham Ali Tabatabai.
Yeah.
So in Lebanon, over the past 2 years, 4,000 Lebanese have been killed by the Israelis. Nearly 1.2 million have been displaced or something like that. So what's the situation there? I mean, if you're looking at um, I mean, for me, when you look at Lebanon, similar thing in Gaza, where Israel makes all these demands that are really impossible for any organization to accept. In the case of
Yeah.
Lebanon, a disarmament of Hezbollah, for the government to impose, for the government to Lebanese government to disarm Hezbollah. How do they do that without a civil war? So these kind of impossible demands, which are really pretext to continue the war and the ongoing
Yeah.
genocide.
Well, Haytham al-Tabatabai was the military, most senior military commander in Hezbollah. He was apparently a founding member of the organization and of its military forces, and replaced the military commander Fuad Shukr, who was assassinated by Israel last year, and is essentially the second most senior member of the organization. In addition to that, he was assassinated in the heart of the southern suburbs of Beirut. So, on that alone, all manner of red lines were crossed, as Hezbollah stated, by Israel in the assassination. Now, the question becomes that Israel has been claiming that Hezbollah has been rearming and reorganizing at an increasingly rapid pace. And some people have suggested that Israel's objective with this assassination was to provoke Hezbollah into a response at a time when Hezbollah, by its own criteria, is not yet ready for a full-scale confrontation with Israel, and therefore Israel could then use its, let's say, insufficient state of preparedness to administer a very heavy blow to the organization. If Israeli reports about Hezbollah's rearmament, but as yet incompleted reorganization are correct, then at least from what we've seen so far, Hezbollah hasn't fallen into the trap, although there is growing belief that a renewed confrontation between Israel and Hezbollah is only a matter of time. The other element of this is, as you mentioned, the domestic Lebanese dimensions of this, which is that you have a government that would like to have a monopoly on arms within Lebanon, but on the one hand has absolutely no capacity to disarm a much more powerful Hezbollah. At the same time, has absolutely no capacity to defend Lebanon and its sovereignty from these persistent Israeli attacks, and is also increasingly seen as doing the bidding of the United States rather than of the Lebanese people. And of course, as is so often the case in Lebanon, the Lebanese themselves are very much divided on this issue. And I think the consensus is that a renewed full-scale eruption of hostilities between the two is just a matter of time, which then brings in the additional question of, will Iran sit this one out as well as it did last year, or will it conclude that a renewed Israeli attack on Iran is inevitable as well and seek to join the fray in defense of its partner in Lebanon? And these are really all unanswered questions.
Thanks, Moin. As always, pleasure talking to you. Hope to
Thank you,
see you
Nassim.
again next week for another episode. And thank you also for joining us. Do like our podcast and go to YouTube and share the podcast as well. So see you next week for another episode of Palestine This Week. Bye bye.